Well, congratulations, Jeff and Aman, on that initiative, and congratulations, President Rob, for the idea of the relationship, because that's obviously going to be a terrific relationship for this club and very worthwhile. But my job here is to introduce our guest speaker, Michael Burdett, who's the South Australian Surveyor-General. Not far from here, probably 400 or 500 metres, is the statue of our first surveyor. Of course, almost everybody in South Australia would be aware of the role of the surveyor, probably more than in any other state. The role of Colonel William Light in the establishment of this state is legendary here, and Michael follows in that tradition. He comes from a long line of Surveyors-General. Michael, unlike many others, has come directly out of the private sector. After 40 years in the private sector, or something like 40 years, is now taking on the role in the public sector and heading up the Surveyor-General's department. What does the Surveyor-General actually do today? What is their role? We'll leave Michael to explain that to you. Would you please welcome Surveyor-General Michael Burdett.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm not going to speak terribly much about what the Surveyor-General does, but I'll just give you very quickly its role of surveying and mapping. So looking after the integrity of the state's land boundary system is my most critical role, but probably a part that only occupies about 30% of my time. The rest is spent on mapping. We all just expect to have maps. We expect to be able to turn our phone on and have Google Maps available. But my office is the one that keeps those maps up to date. As we get new areas, new roads, we're the ones that map those into the system. But what I'm going to talk to you today is about the borders of South Australia. We had a national project in the last couple of years where we're trying to get agreed borders across each of the jurisdictions in the country, and that sounds quite easy. It proved to be quite difficult. And I'll explain why. Most of the difficulty actually just comes from our history. I did find it very interesting when I was looking into it, but I will just point out that I'm a surveyor, not a historian, so if I get one of the years wrong or one of the names wrong, please forgive me. It's a general interest story. This is a picture that's in the State Library of a survey party in the early part of our settlement, and it does show you the sort of environment that those people of the day had to work from, and it's because of that that we have the remaining problems within our state borders. I'd like to just point out also that in a lot of the research I did, there's some very good publications, one by Bob Dunn, another by Jack Keane, and one by David Taylor, and some of the images I'd like to acknowledge have come from them. But if we go right back to our proclamation, Governor Hindmarsh on his proclamation made the following statement, that our border would be on the north 26 degrees south latitude, on the south the Southern Ocean, on the west the 132nd degree of longitude, and on the east the 41st degree of east longitude, including all of the bays and gulfs together, with the island called Kangaroo Island and all and every one of the islands adjacent to the said last mentioned island, and to those adjacent the mainland of the province. What's important about that statement is that, and I'm sorry some of these maps are a little bit light, but if you can bear with me. So the original proclamation of South Australia, we didn't go up to the Western Australian border. We had a 300-kilometre gap. So the gap between us and Western Australia at that time, at the proclamation, was New South Wales. And it wasn't until quite a few years later that South Australia managed to negotiate with New South Wales and get our border moved right across to match up with that of Western Australia. What's also important in that statement of Hindmarsh was that it included the Gulfs. Now, normally, the jurisdiction of any state boundary goes 3 miles offshore. So without that proclamation that the Gulfs were included, South Australia wouldn't have had jurisdiction over our Gulfs, only out to the 3 mile mark. So our border on the southern boundaries includes the 2 Gulfs, goes to Kangaroo Island and goes 3 miles beyond any island that sits off South Australia. That can be quite important in the work that we've been doing as the Surveyor-Generals around the country over the last few years. When they mapped the islands, and we have just done that for South Australia, we've very accurately mapped our coastline. When they did that in Western Australia, they found a very small island, about the size of this lectern, a couple of 100 kilometres offshore, and it moved the Western Australian jurisdiction a couple of 100 miles offshore, which then included the gas fields, and it was worth some billions of dollars to the Western Australian government and took that money away from the federal government. So the fact that our islands are included is actually a very critical point. I'll start on the Western Australian border, and it was one of the latter to be surveyed, but I'll start over there. The government, George Dodwell was a government astronomer in 1921, and he and 2 surveyors, one from each of Western Australia and South Australia, went across on the railway line to as close to the border as they could determine without measurement, and took a number of astronomical observations. Longitudes determined by time from Greenwich, and that time is then related into an angle on the Earth. So an accurate measurement of time is critical if you're trying to determine longitude. And for the first time, these 2 surveyors and the government astronomer took their time measurement by measuring the time from radio waves going both directions around the Earth. So they took it from France and from America and took the mean of that time to determine the position on the border there at Deakin. They determined the longitude, established a pillar at Deakin, which is north up on the railway line. And modern measurements have determined that was within it was better than 50 metres. It was a measurement that's accurate to within 50 metres of what we can measure today with our GPS that we rely on so easily. It is strange to think that today we can walk out with a mobile phone and measure more accurately than these surveyors could with all of their science and instruments of the day. So they managed to lay that mark within 1 second of arc. So you have degrees, minutes and seconds. Within 1.8 seconds was the position of that. They then travelled around the coast and went up near Kununurra, up on Argyle Cattle Station, and they did the same observations at the northern end of the Western Australian border. And it was then that the Premier of each of the 2 states and the Prime Ministers made a declaration that the border of South Australia shall be from the Deakin Pillar north and from the Argyle Pillar south. But when that was done and determined in the 1950s, of course they didn't quite meet up. So in the northwest corner of South Australia, we have a survey mark, a concrete pillar, known as Surveyor-General's Corner, and it was actually marked 50 years ago this June. We hope to have a small celebration out in the middle of the desert to commemorate that. And so the pillar for South Australia is 127 metres east of the pillar that forms the boundary of the Northern Territory in Western Australia. So 2 pillars sitting out in the desert. Unfortunately, some miserable 4-wheel driver has gone and knocked the top off one of our concrete pillars out there. We hope to replace that in our trip out there in June. But it's interesting that we think of that border as a straight line, but in fact it's got a step in it at the border. We have actually surveyed the border at the highway, the Adelaide to Perth highway, and that boundary has been marked to the south and a pillar marked at the Great Australian Bight, but the remainder of that border remains unmarked. Most of you would be aware of the geography of South Australia, very difficult country. They haven't found a lot of minerals on it, and hence there's been no need to mark that border. I will now move across to the Victorian border, and this one, of course, is the contentious one, even to the point where they've made beer advertisements about it. But in fact, it was a very contentious border. This photograph was the first survey mark placed near that border. It was called Tyer's Arrow. He was the astronomer that went and first determined the position of the border. That border was marked on the 141st degree of east longitude. He put this survey mark in, did a whole series of observations, very, very complex observations. Remember, they were taking observations with fairly rudimentary instruments, but also they had to do their calculations with logbooks. I started with a handheld calculator. I think if I'd had to continue surveying with logbooks, I would have become an engineer, because it really would have been very tedious calculations. But he determined the border, and then two surveyors, one from Victoria, one from South Australia. This was Henry Wade, who was the head surveyor. He was from Victoria, and a sort of a young graduate surveyor, if you like, a trainee from South Australia, Charles White. They surveyed the first 200 kilometres of the border, coming up from that an offset off that arrows that Tyers had placed. In their journal, they recorded great hardship being experienced by man and beast, and I think if you go back to that photograph I showed at the start, you can imagine trying to deal with the mud and slush down in the southeast, turning into the heat and desert of the as you get halfway up that border. They marked the first 200 kilometres up towards the river. This is a copy of the field notes where they finished their survey. And then that survey was carried on by White alone in the following year. He had to mark the border, the part of the border that was through the desert, and endured very, very significant hardship. Many of his horses and beasts died in doing that. Difficult country where they didn't have a lot of stones to be able to mark the boundaries in a durable way. It was a great shame that within only about a year of him doing that survey, a fire went through and destroyed many of the marks that he placed on that border. So for the effort they put in, there wasn't great lasting reward for what they did. But what he did manage to do was survey right through to the river. This is one of the few remaining marks that he placed. There was 2 stone cans of this size were placed up south of the river that marked that border. But between his commencement point and these marks, there's very little that remains in evidence of that survey. Remarkably, though, he turned out to be a very good surveyor, and when we go out again with modern measurements, he managed to survey from the marks that Wade and White had put in through to the river, and he was within 30 metres of being true north of his start point. Now that's a remarkable feat when you when you consider the instrumentation that they had. It's not a dead straight line. They would survey, they would then take some astronomical observations, they would make adjustments along the way. So it is a little bit of a wiggly straight line, if you like, that they managed to mark. Of course, the contention then started because after that, when the New South Wales surveyors wanted to mark the border further north, they did some astronomical observations and found that in fact the longitude was incorrect. When the observations were done by Tyers, he had used the longitude of Fort Macquarie at the time and taken his time observations from there and transferred them across to the border. Fort Macquarie time was actually found to be 2 minutes out of position, on time, and hence when you translated that down on the border, it showed that there was about a 3 kilometre error in the placement of that longitude. So the border was placed 3 kilometres too far to the west, so South Australia was missing out on 3 kilometres of land. They didn't get overly concerned for a long time, but eventually South Australia decided they wanted that back. So they went and fought the Victorians for a number of years through the court systems, ended up in the Privy Council, and the Privy Council said, no, the border's been marked, that's what should be agreed, and so South Australia missed out on the 3 kilometres. But after Wade and White had been through that area, when New South Wales came through from the east and started marking out their agricultural land, they couldn't find the line that White had surveyed because of that fire that had been through. And so they started laying out the land, and they didn't know where the border was, so they stopped well short, knowing that they would be, so that they didn't encroach into South Australia. As it turned out, they were about 600 kilometres short of hitting the South Australian border. So they stopped there. When South Australia came along, they said, well, we don't know where it is either, we'll just go up to the line they had. So we got 600 metres back of our 3 kilometres. And in fact, that 600 metres, that's quite a long line. You're talking about about 200 kilometres of boundary that's between 600 and 250 metres out of position, where South Australia has laid out title into Victoria. That has never been sorted out. We've been to the Crown Solicitor's office and asked them to give us an opinion on where does it stand and how could we rectify that. When the answer came back, we could rectify it by going to a referendum to come to an agreement between the two states. We made a determination that much of it is a national park. The rest, nobody really is terribly fussed about it. We did ask the Mines Department. They said there's no great mineralisation, there's no oil, there's no gas. So we said, well, we might just leave it alone. And administratively, the two Surveyor-Generals, South Australia and Victoria, have agreed that we'll use the line that was where the two land boundaries abut. We'll use that as the administrative line. But if there was ever a real need to determine it, which would probably come about if somebody got shot or if we did find oil or gas, we'll then determine where the boundary is. But it did create one other dilemma, because South Australia was never supposed to have a river boundary with Victoria. But we now have a 3 kilometre stretch of river where we have a boundary between us. And the question then comes, is the boundary... Victoria, when that was laid out from New South Wales, the border was the southern bank of the river. Obviously, New South Wales wanted to keep the water. We're even arguing about water back in the 1800s. But the standard agreement between two parties when you have a river border is the middle of the river. And again, we went off to the Crown Solicitor's office and said, well, what's the right answer? Is it the middle of the river? Is it at the south bank of the river? Didn't like that answer either. So we've agreed to disagree on that. I believe it should be the south bank of the river. Victoria never had claim to anything beyond the south bank. Victorian Surveyor-General thinks it should be the middle of the river, unsurprisingly. So we've just agreed to disagree. And again, if you want to go fishing up there and you need a Victorian licence, fish on the northern side of the bank, not on the southern side of the bank, and you won't get yourself into trouble. But I don't think any fisheries inspectors are going to take you up on that. Once they went north, they then had to decide, were they going to carry on with the 3 kilometre discrepancy or would they fix it? Goyder, in fact, wanted to carry on and just leave South Australia short right through to the Queensland border, but the New South Wales people did want it corrected, and it was put back onto the correction. And that's why if you look at any map at almost any scale, you'll see the step in the boundary of South Australia at the river. We've got 3 major corners: Cameron's Corner, Haddon's Corner and Popel's Corner, the borders between the different states. Out in the desert, as you head north up through there, this one's Cameron's Corner, the border between New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. And that's typical of the sort of countryside in which they sit, and shows you the hardship that people had to endure in surveying those borders. We've actually got 2 of the original posts. We've got the post that was placed by Popel up on the Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australian border. We've got that post in South Australia still, and in my office we have Haddon's Corner, the post which is the north-east corner of South Australia where we abut with Queensland. So those original posts that were placed back in the 1800s still exist, and they sit as part of our history. In fact, Popel, when he placed his post, dragged the post, because there was no posts in the region, he dragged that post over 60 kilometres to be able to mark the corner properly. I don't think I would have done that. I would have found some stones, I think. But they've all been replaced with concrete pillars to properly reflect the boundaries with some permanency. The last piece that Popel did, he surveyed a lot of the New South Wales border and a lot of the came across on the South Australian border and then continued all the way up to Gulf of Carpentaria, marking the Queensland border. Those he went almost blind in doing it. He did a remarkable job. He really was a very high quality surveyor, and when we've done resurveys over some of that, we're just amazed at the accuracy of those surveys. Remember that when they're marking out the latitude, so the 26 degrees south on our northern border with the Northern Territory and Queensland, a line of latitude is not a straight line, it's a curve on the earth. And so in marking that border, he laid it out as 10-mile straight lines, so chords around the curve. So I'll perhaps leave you with that. I find where we all just think we have state borders and they'd be very simple, and it would be there wouldn't be much contention about them. You don't have to go far into the history to find where some of those histories left us with some of those discrepancies. And for much of the borders that we have, we've still never surveyed them, which I find quite remarkable in this day and age. Thank you.
Well, what an extraordinarily interesting history there is to the state's borders. I'm sure that was absolutely fascinating. Are there any questions from members of the audience? Yeah, Peter. Peter, you need this.
Michael, thank you for a wonderful talk. Just a question around subterranean structure. So what happens around minerals and oils and ownership of those assets? Do they get split evenly across the state, or is it who digs the first hole gets it?
Certainly they get fairly sensitive about where they drill the wellhead. I don't actually know the answer about where you draw. So if you drill a wellhead near the border and start drawing from a field that's across the border, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure we could have a good dispute over it, though.
David.
I had a client with a huge cattle station north of Maree, and I flew in there one day and to spend a bit of time with them. In one of their big old sheds, there was hanging a chain measure. And I was told by that client, and they're still there, they've been there for centuries, or generations, that was the chain used to mark out the Northern Territory South Australian border. And he said it had to be inaccurate towards the end, because every time they drag it across the ground and over rocks and so on, the links would get smaller and smaller, so it couldn't be dead accurate. But I thought you might be interested in that.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. Those chains typically got longer and longer. Across up near the Simpson Desert on the Northern Territory border is the heat. When you heat steel, of course, it gets longer, and in a circumstance like that, it could be as much as certainly 1.5 inches in the day every time they measured 100-metre length. So that's, you do get quite a bit of discrepancy. Surveyors do take account for that, but many surveyors of that era didn't, and hence generally surveyors didn't worry too much, because if you're laying out more land, if you're giving somebody more land than you've told them, nobody's very upset. It's when you go the other way that people get upset. So the fact that it's always a bit longer is okay.
Thanks, Michael. Fascinating. I've got a couple of questions. Is a lot of this contention due to the fact that the Earth is not a sphere? That's probably simplistic. And secondly, having wandered around the Flinders Ranges with a bunch of unwilling kids, I encountered a thing called survey error. The GPS tells you one thing and the map tells you another. As long as you treat them in isolation, that seems to work. My question is, when it comes to a point of law, and you've partially addressed that, the answer is never very clear, but will modern GPS measurement stack up legally against what's on the map?
No, it won't, because as the Privy Council found, what's been marked on the ground takes precedent over the measurement. And that is a principle that sits in surveying. If you can find the evidence of where the boundary was originally marked, that will always take precedence over the measurement. Just the GPS one is an interesting one, because we now have it where, your mobile phone will tell you which street corner you're on. Within 5 years, your mobile phone will tell you a measurement within about 100 mil. We are heading for that sort of accuracy of measurement so we will be able to determine things, our measurements very accurately, but we'll always go back. The legal determination will be a different matter.
Sorry. Are you only responsible for mapping, or are you also responsible for place names? So, if so, who is allowed to name things, and how does this actually get fixed and legally put together?
If you want to change the name of your suburb, come and see me later. My office is responsible for geographic names. There's a piece of legislation called the Geographic Names Act, and there's a process if we do want to change the names of places. Largely, most things have been named by now, of course, but not all. We would like to get many more Indigenous names into the system, and we do have about 350 dual names in the state where we now call it Lake Eyre Caddy Thunder. You can use either name. They can be used separately or jointly. But we do have a process where we can change the name of whether it's a suburb or a hill or a river or a valley. We can change those names, but we're reluctant to, because those names carry a great deal of our history. There is a move in a couple of the other states at the moment to try and get rid of some of the names that are seen as being inappropriate. I don't think we have a great many, but you don't have to go. We do certainly have some. We have a name up near Burra called World's End, which perhaps some people might think is a bit inappropriate, but there are some that relate to culture, and perhaps they are. We'd be happy to look at changing them if people approach us.
Michael, you just hit on a very interesting point. When you've got Indigenous names, quite often there's overlap between tribal groupings and all that sort of stuff. How does that work?
I'm happy to assign a name if the Indigenous people come to me and want to place that name. In fact, we've been trying to encourage them too. But we say to them, please sort the name out before you come to me, because I can't adjudicate between the different clans and groups that are out there. So they do need to determine what those names are, through their own social networks, and then we're happy to assign them and put them into our mapping database. We have about 50,000 geographic names in South Australia, and they do relate from a whole raft of sources.
Well, for fear that Steve will stand up and ask a fourth question, I think it's time we called that to a halt. Can I just thank Michael for that? I spent for a short time spent a period on Michael's Geographical Names Board, not when he was Surveyor-General, but I remember spending 6 months debating over whether it was called the River Murray or the Murray River. So these are significant issues, So, can I ask you all please to join me in thanking Michael for a fascinating address?